Hey, shout out to Nash Cohen, Chief Troublemaker.
I'm a game changer, I'm a disruptor. It's not just one example or a recent thing. This is something I've been doing since I was 19 years old and finding different ways to hack the system.
Let me tell them about levels. Jump on the rhythm, man, I'ma set levels. Nah, fam, you can't tell me about levels. Man, I set pace, man, I set levels. Take it too far, take it to the next level.
Alright guys, and welcome to my very first blog. Genuinely, this is the first time I'm sitting in front of a camera and talking about a general subject. I've got a bit of a framework of what I want to talk about, but essentially I'm just freewheeling. And I've done a lot of this stuff before in terms of watching people blog and doing training sessions and all that sort of thing. One of my biggest gripes is always that people take far too long to get into the training material. And I've got to be honest, I don't have all day either. So without being a victim of that same thing, let's jump into it. I want to talk about questions and the way we go about asking questions and what they can do for us in the sales process. Because I think it's often a very misconceived area. Certainly most good salespeople will realize they have to ask questions to sell rather than tell. But to most beginner salespeople, they often think, hey, selling is showing off. Selling is kind of, promoting your product when it may not be good or may not be wanted. But that's not actually the truth. It's not about doing that at all. Telling isn't selling. That's something we say in sales quite a lot. The key is to ask questions, and really where that starts is with your own self-examination. Often the questions we ask of ourselves are really quite difficult to answer and can give us perspective on other questions that we may ask other people and what they do to those people, especially on an emotional level. And I always think it's quite interesting when you look at branding of individuals or a product of a brand of a product, whatever it may be. And you ask people who are involved in the early stages of that product or that development, who's your audience? And they say, anyone's my audience. And you realize that that actually is a question they can't answer at that stage. And it's a kind of process that you go through where you have to break it down further with further questions to get the right answer to understand where you're going. And that's a little bit like what we do in sales. So, we ask people when it comes to the branding question, what's different about you? What's your secret sauce? Why are your values different? And we kind of hone it down to a more and more finite place so we can identify who the audience is. It's the same way in sales, we kind of hone our questions down. So most salespeople will often start doing sales when they're a beginner and they'll think it's about showing off. And it's a very unnatural thing to show off for someone. They don't have the ability to feel good about themselves when they're showing off, so they don't feel comfortable. So it's kind of a painful thing that you don't want to do. And that's why I think a lot of people say, hey, I'm no good at sales. But reality is that's not sales. And if people actually knew what it was, I reckon they'd say, hey, I'm great at that. And that really is just asking questions and getting on with people. That's how it starts. But there's an important principle I think we need to understand in the term of the way people tend to sell. And we're going to talk about beginner salespeople because they're the ones that tend to make the mistakes. And I'll give you an example. When you've got a salesperson who's sitting there and saying, hold on, this product had everything right for them. It had the right specifications. It was the right price. Why didn't they buy? They're failing to understand a key thing about sales. And this leads straight into questions. So don't think I'm segueing away from it. It does lead into questions afterwards. It's the idea of needs versus wants. It's the idea of logic versus emotion. Needs, what do we need? We need a roof over our head. Doesn't need to be a big roof, it just needs to be a roof. We need food. Doesn't need to be world-class food, it just needs to be food. Our needs are our most basic subsistence things that we kind of gather, deal with every day. The air we breathe is a need. And like that in so many things, needs only cover our most basic requirements. Wants cover everything else. And if you want to take anything that we sell in society, it's very rare that people will buy the most basic form. I look at things like Nurofen, and you can see Nurofen selling for £3.50 and exactly the same product next to it selling for 99p on a no-name, no-value brand type, no-nonsense brand. So I just kind of, believe that most people's things that they buy, that they desire, are wants. And it's the nature of materialism, it's the nature of capitalism. So let me give you an example. I could not get anyone excited, really, I don't think, about buying a Skoda, unless their particular fetish was cheapness or, a lack of design aesthetic. But I could get people to want buying a Bentley or a DB9. And it's the very reason that the car industry is so successful, actually. And I say use the example of cars. Cars is the best example. Nobody needs a £100,000 car. Nobody needs a £50,000 car. They want the feeling they get when they drive a £100,000 car, or a £200,000 car. They feel a certain way, and that's what they want, the emotional response to it. And those wants are driven by some very interesting things, which is going to be different for every person. And really what's going to happen is people are going to walk into your environment and say, I need that product. And you have to turn around and find out, yes, I know you need it, but I'm not interested in why you need it. I have to understand why you want it. Because if I can understand why you want it, I know that wants are far more powerful, far more persuasive, far more impactful, and far more likely to influence your behavior to make a decision which goes above your basic requirements. That's exactly what it is. The difference between needs and wants are that needs are absolutely a must, but you will go further, or most people will go further and farther for what they want. And the thing that drives that, that's what we have to find out. So those are the questions we have to start trying to identify. And we talk about needs and wants. There's a kind of second part to it as well. It's not the same, but it connects straight into it. It's the idea of pleasure versus pain. I saw this up close and personal when I worked for a company called LA Fitness. It's really interesting. I worked in the health and fitness industry for a few years. It was great, actually, really, really enjoyable industry. One of the most amazing things about LA Fitness was the way they marketed themselves, because most fitness companies were out there saying, look at me, aren't I great? Don't you want to look like that? If you want to look at that, come into the gym. And they would adorn pictures of physically beautiful people, not that I am, but physically beautiful people on their marketing. And that was really intimidating to a lot of people. And you've got to remember that 95%, 98%, 99% of people aren't ever going to look like that. And not just don't they look like that, not are they never just going to look like that, they also don't necessarily admire people that look like that and actually feel a little bit intimidated maybe. Whatever the emotional response is, it's certainly not desired. LA Fitness realized this quite early on and changed their marketing very cleverly. Firstly, they always put very ordinary, if you don't mind me saying, people looking normal people. That's probably the right way to say it. But secondly, more importantly, they understood that the greatest thing, the greatest motivation they could provide someone to get up off their couch who was in a situation where they were fat, overweight, diabetic, whatever it may be, where their health was at risk. The biggest motivation was not the prospect of running towards joy and pleasure. It was the prospect of running away from the biggest fear of all, which is death. And this is something which motivates behavior far more than pleasures. Pain and future pain illustrates that all the time. Let me give you an example. Maybe you wake up by alarm clock, and I know we're in coronavirus, so this might not be the best example, but let's say we're out of coronavirus and we're back to the days when everything was normal and you got to get up at 6:30 every day to get a 7:30 train to get to work at 8:30. Ooh, that's a horrible life. But more importantly, when your alarm clock went off this morning, if this was what happened this morning, at 6:30, did you hit snooze? The majority of people did. If you then ask, did you hit snooze to gain pleasure or to avoid pain? The answer was to gain pleasure. Did you hit snooze once? Did you hit snooze twice? Did you hit snooze 3 times? Eventually, you stopped hitting snooze and you got up. But why did you get up? You got up not to gain any more pleasure because you've been doing that in bed. You got up to avoid the pain of your boss being angry, firing you, losing money. Future pain is what drives the process of action. Inaction is normally driven by pleasure, but action is normally driven by the prospect of future pain. Another great example, the story of Scrooge. Scrooge, the miserly old man who was visited by 3 wise ghosts. The ghost of Christmas past, showing him in his youth, choosing work and money over love. The ghost of Christmas present who came to show him what was happening that Christmas night, and Tiny Tim who was lame, and his cousin Bob Cratchit and all that. That didn't change his behavior. It was only when the ghost of Christmas future went and took him and to a miserly old death and showed him his miserly old death and being in a situation where he was alone without anyone, that the motivation to actually change occurred. And that's a really, really important lesson. Behavior is normally only really changed when someone is in such a dissatisfied state with either their current state or the prospect of their future state. And the ultimate motivator is death. Sorry to say it like that, but it is death. But obviously, death can come in many formats. Death can be the end of something. Death can be the end of admiration, whatever it may be. So that really is kind of how we get to the needs versus wants, pain versus pleasure scenario. So you've got to realize there's actually a scale that exists in people's minds. When they walk into a place or they approach a company to buy, the normal situation, there's a need, there's a want, there's a pain, there's a pleasure. And it's all kind of laid out in front of you. And there's a big scale, call it the scale of decisiveness. And on one side, you've got buy. And on the other side, you've got not buy. And on the side of buy, you've got a load of things lumped on there. But ultimately, fear is here. You've got joy over here on the other side. Fear, joy. You need to swap them so that the fear is on the side of not buying and the joy is on the side of buying. What essentially you're doing is you're taking someone's wants and you're turning them into needs. And to do that, you're going to take something emotional, that want, and you're going to get them to use logic to justify it. And think about it. We do it all the time. If I was doing a lot of exercise and training hard, and I'm getting more and more tired, I can rationalize stopping. I can rationalize an illogical thing. It's not logical to stop when you feel pain, but your brain rationalizes it as, oh, I'm getting injured. Oh, this is hurting. Oh, I've got to stop. I'm going to die, whatever it is. So it's kind of based on natural human behavior. And I think for some people, that's a little bit why sales can be a scary idea. It's the idea that you're going to sit there and you're essentially going to show off. And you're going to show off and that feels quite uncomfortable. But actually, let's change the situation. Don't show off. First, make friends, then ask questions, then show off. If you do it in that order, it's a lot more comfortable. And actually, that's your job. That's exactly how we go about selling. We make friends, we ask questions, we develop the rapport, and then we show off. So the first part of it is understanding the two types of questions we have. You've got open questions and you've got closed questions. Simply put, open questions are questions which do not require a yes or no answer. Questions where you might have to give an explanation. The kind of list of open questions you tend to be is, what are you looking for? Where have you been looking? What's the best thing you've seen? How long have you been looking for? Why are you looking? That's always the key. And in that respect, you can afford to be like a child. Why? Ask me that. Why? Just keep asking why. Obviously, don't get annoying, but my point being, you need a child's curiosity to be good at sales. You really do. Then you've got closed questions. And closed questions are questions that require a yes or a no answer. Now, for that very reason, bad salespeople, I genuinely say this, and I'm not saying I haven't done it. Occasionally, you do throw in a yes/no question, not because you make a mistake, but because the situation's right. But generally, do not ask closed questions at the beginning of the conversation. Ask questions which kind of denote the ethos of 2 ears, 1 mouth, use them in those proportions. Ask small questions to elicit big responses. And I've got to be honest, when I have a list of questions I ask, I always have a certain order I ask them in. Probably the most important question ever is why, because motivation is what determines action. But actually the biggest question I always ask is the first question. And I always say, what are you looking for? And by asking that question, you get someone to respond in a way where they keep just talking. And actually they may give you all the answers for your entire questionnaire. You don't need to ask any more questions because they've answered what you are looking for so completely. So that's open questions. And for that reason, you ask open questions when you're opening, when you're registering your applicant, when you're getting to know them. Closed questions, in my mind, are primarily used for closing. It's fairly easy to get. Open questions, open, closed questions, closed. And the right sort of closed questions you'd be asking are normally questions in a succession, but they're like, is this the best thing you see? Does it match all your requirements? Are you going to put in an offer? These are the sorts of questions that can actually push your action towards a certain place and a certain point or stage of the sales process that you need to get to. But you can't ask them at the wrong time. And that's one of the biggest things about questions. Questions are not just knowing what to ask, because in quite all honesty, you know what questions to ask. You can list them. If I said to you, list every single sales question, you'd come up with all these questions. It's knowing when to ask them. Knowing what to ask, but knowing when to ask it. So once you can identify the pain, and you can use questions to further add more salt to the wound. And that's really, I think, one of the processes of sales is to identify where the pain is, find the wound. Maybe it's an old wound, maybe it's a new wound. Cut that wound open, take your fingers, rub it in salt and stick it in the wound. That's really what you're doing. You're sticking salt in the wound. And again, telling isn't selling. So you telling someone that this is their pain is no good. You need to ask questions so that they produce the answers. Without leading them too much, you need to ask general open questions. And when you're identifying pain, one of the ways you do that is, kind of asking what the pain points are. What's your biggest frustration? Why are you not closing sales? Why are you not achieving it? Why do you not feel great? What's stopping you doing this? What's your boss's biggest gripe? These are the things which identify where the pain is. And it's a very, very important thing, but it's only one half of it. You've identified the pain. You then need to switch, as I've said, you need to switch where the joy is currently, which is not buying, onto the side of buying, and you take the fear and you've got to put it onto the not buying side. The fear has to be centered around the not buying. So how do you do that? Well, very simply, if you've asked that first question about where the pain is and identify that those are the pain points. So your boss is really obsessive with getting productivity to level X. What will happen if your boss doesn't get this sorted? If we don't achieve this, how's your boss going to react? What will happen if you don't get to feel like that? You could ask someone, what's the best thing you see about driving this car? And they might say, the wind through my hair, driving down Manhattan Boulevard, feeling amazing, and people looking at me and thinking, I'm the man. The question to ask after that would be, how would it feel not to have that? Could you live with that? Is that good enough for you? And I think that's right, because a lot of people set themselves up in these situations to be certain people of certain places that like certain things. But you can exacerbate that. So if they make a stand as being a certain person, reinforce that they are that person. Listen, I don't know a lot about you, but from what I do know, you're not the sort of person to let something like money stand in the way of getting what you want. You want a feeling and you want to feel a certain way. Money's irrelevant. Let's get this done. And I think that's a really, really important thing to be able to do, is to challenge people on who they are. Identify who they are, find their pain points. Maybe they want to keep up the Joneses. Maybe they want the latest car simulator. Maybe they want the highest level of productivity and efficiency. Maybe they want to be as cheap as hell. But whatever is that pain, you need to find a way to exacerbate it, make it worse. Because when they're in those conditions, when they're feeling bad, when they're tired from the training, you coming along and saying, hey, I can relieve that pain, is what will close the sale. And all you're doing is you're giving them the chance to take that illogical want and justify it with logic. Just like you do when you're in the middle of a training session and logically you shouldn't quit because you want to improve, but you do. You're giving them that same option. It's a bit negative to look at it like that, but that's exactly what you're doing. You're giving them relief. You're making their pain worse, you're exacerbating it, and then you're giving them relief. And that really, for me, is what questions are all about. And that's what good sales is all about. 2 ears, 1 mouth. Use them in those proportions, but use it right. Use it powerfully. So questions control the situation for sure, but great questions control the outcome. You know exactly what to ask. You do. You just need to know when to ask it. Guys, that's the end of it. If any of you need help or advice on how to put the right questions into a system so that are asked at the right time, into a process, how to develop KPIs to ensure that you're getting these points ticked off, or that it's for you or it's for your workforce, whatever it is, talk to me. I love the science of sales. I love talking about it. I love interacting and I love learning. So if you think anything is not correct in this, talk to me. Tell me I'm wrong. Let's bring you on here live. We'll do it when Corona's over. Have an awesome one. Hope you enjoyed it, and change the game. Change the game, guys. That's what it's about. I'll see you next week.
Let me tell them about levels. Jump on the rhythm, man, I'm a set levels. Nah, fam, you can't tell me about levels. Man, I set pace.